We don't know exactly when Anne first caught the eye of Henry VIII. Henry was first attracted to Anne's sister, Mary, who came to court before Anne did. Mary was Henry's mistress in the early 1520s and even gave birth to the king's illegitimate son. Mary eventually fell out of favor with the king and didn't have much to show for their time together. Anne learned a lot from what befell her sister. Nonetheless, Henry soon found himself pining after the coy and mysterious Anne Boleyn. In early 1523, Anne became seriously involved with a courtier named Henry Percy, the son and heir of the Earl of Northumberland. It was rumored that the pair were engaged, despite not having the blessing of the Earl or the King. King Henry ordered Cardinal Thomas Wolsey to end the match and ensure Percy's previously arranged marriage proceeded. The king's jealousy in this matter revealed how deeply he had fallen for Anne, and Anne began to think, if I can't be an earl's wife, why not try for the crown of England? Henry found his match in Anne. At the age of 20, she gave him a run for his money with her knowledge of courtly intrigue and her refusal to settle for the role of mistress. Anne was a master of playing hard to get, which was a new experience for a king who was used to getting whatever, or whoever, he wanted. It is said that she was the only woman who ever dared to argue back to Henry. It's difficult to explain exactly how Anne was able to capture and maintain the affections of the king for such a long time, despite great obstacles and the malevolent gossip of the court. But she made her intentions clear. She would settle for nothing less than marriage. If Henry hoped to win over Anne Boleyn and solve his lingering succession problem, he would have to find a way to end his marriage with Catherine of Aragon. Beginning in 1527, Henry began to pursue what became known as the King's Great Matter, his divorce from Catherine. Henry seemed to have convinced himself that his marriage to Catherine had been against divine law. The book of Leviticus in the Old Testament forbids marriage with a brother's widow. Henry believed that the deaths of his and Catherine's children proved God's condemnation of their union. With this as the basis for his petition, Henry appealed to Rome for an annulment of his marriage. While popes had granted kings annulments for far less in the past, Henry VIII tragically picked the time and case poorly. Henry was asking Pope Clement VII to help cast aside the aunt of Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. Pope Clement had been held captive by the emperor from 1527 to 1528, after which time the pope dared not cross Charles V again. Additionally, Pope Clement's unwillingness to grant the annulment was increased by the fact that he was being asked to declare an earlier exercise of papal power to be illegal. All of this essentially doomed Henry's attempts to solve his dilemma in a legal fashion from the very beginning. Despite this resistance from the Catholic Church, Henry and his advisors continued to diligently petition for the annulment. They tried to keep Catherine in the dark for as long as possible, but Catherine was no fool. She was well aware of the growing attraction between her husband and Anne. Henry regularly avoided Catherine's company, though he always made sure to attend official functions with his wife. Despite his desire to annul their marriage, Henry had the utmost respect for Catherine and hoped that they could split amicably. He was prepared to be very generous and ensure that Catherine lived the rest of her life comfortably. When the news of the king's plans to divorce his queen became official, Catherine was given counsel, but only that given by the king. Catherine refused to bow to Henry's demands, earnestly swearing that her marriage to Arthur was never consummated. Catherine sought support from the Spanish ambassador and close friends at court. In many ways, Catherine held the upper hand in this battle. She was a widely respected and beloved queen, and Anne Boleyn was not particularly popular. She had little trouble in defending the righteousness of her position, with both the Pope and public opinion on her side. Catherine was also motivated by the fact that if their marriage was annulled, her daughter Mary would be labeled illegitimate. And so, the King's Great Matter drug on for over 6 years. Henry was growing older, and Anne lamented that her youth was being wasted to no purpose. Henry grew weary of the endless hearings and rejections, and Catherine still refused to relinquish her rightful position as his wife and queen. Catherine had encouraged Mary to be steadfast in protecting her rights as princess. Even after Henry forbade Catherine and Mary from seeing each other, neither of them would budge. Something had to be done to end the stalemate. Henry made the fateful decision that he did not require approval from the Vatican for an annulment. In 1533, the king rejected the authority of the Holy See and declared himself to be the supreme head of the Church of England. Henry had Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, annul his marriage to Catherine. Henry and Anne Boleyn had already been wed in secret before the annulment was granted. Parliament then declared that the king, not the Pope, would henceforth be the head of the Church of England. The Pope retaliated against Henry by issuing him a sentence of excommunication. No one in England even batted an eye when the message arrived. Aw, the Pope is like the kid who says you're uninvited to his birthday party when you weren't even planning on coming in the first place. Even after the annulment was granted, Catherine refused to recognize the legitimacy of Henry's actions and still considered herself to be Queen of England. Her new title was Princess Dowager of Wales, but she refused to be called princess. She even declined to send Anne Boleyn her crown jewels when she was asked for them. Sick burn, Catherine. The final years of Catherine's life were sad and lonely. She was exiled from court and sent to a series of damp, unpleasant castles to live out the rest of her days. Still unable to see her daughter, the Spanish ambassador helped smuggle letters between Catherine and Mary. Catherine of Aragon died at Kimbleton Castle in Cambridgeshire, England, on January 7, 1536, at the age of 50. A series of ongoing illnesses and the psychological effects of her exile were likely the causes of death. There were rumors of her being poisoned on the orders of her ex-husband, but if Henry so wished to rid himself of Catherine, he likely would have taken that course years earlier and saved himself a lot of trouble. She was buried at Peterborough Abbey with all the honors befitting the widow of the Prince of Wales. To her dying day, Catherine of Aragon considered herself to be the true, legitimate Queen of England. Even before the annulment went through, Anne Boleyn had very few allies at court. Her small handful of supporters largely consisted of those who were trying to ride her coattails to higher positions of power, including her own family. Much of England did not approve of the match, but most found it easier to hate Anne than to hate their monarch. There is strong circumstantial evidence that Henry and Anne were married in a secret wedding in 1532. Anne would give birth to a child in September of 1533, and it is unlikely that they would suddenly have premarital sex after waiting years to be together. When it was announced that Anne was pregnant in 1533, Henry was over the moon. Physicians and astrologers alike predicted that Anne would bear a son. He rested assured that Anne was pregnant with his long-awaited son, and the annulment that soon followed ensured that he would be legitimate. Anne's coronation was an extravagant event, and Henry spared no expense for the occasion. Even so, the people of London were conspicuously unimpressed. The honeymoon period could have ended on September 7, 1533. The baby boy that the physicians and astronomers had predicted did not appear. Instead, Anne gave birth to a healthy baby girl. But this was not the massive disappointment for Henry that many think it was. The birth was quick and easy, and Anne recovered quickly. The king had every reason to believe that healthy sons would follow. They named their new baby daughter Elizabeth. However, Anne's standing with her husband deteriorated over the next 3 years as she suffered 2 miscarriages, at least one of which was a son. The second of these 2 miscarriages occurred on January 28, 1536, just 6 days after Catherine of Aragon passed away. Henry's health had also begun to deteriorate. He was now in his mid-40s and was becoming increasingly obese, a far cry from the powerful, virile man he once was. He began developing ulcers on his legs after sustaining injuries while jousting, which caused him to be less active and made his obesity even worse. All of this, along with the stress of still not having a male heir, caused him to struggle with impotence. Henry began to suspect that his marriage to Anne may be as cursed as his previous marriage to Catherine. If God had not given them a healthy son, it must be because the marriage was not favorable in his eyes. The miscarriage of a baby boy in 1536, along with the death of Catherine of Aragon, pushed Henry into action. Much of Europe still considered Catherine to be Henry's rightful wife, even after the annulment was granted. Now that Catherine had died, if Henry could rid himself of Anne, he could have yet another chance at a male heir, and he could wipe the slate clean with a new marriage that was not tainted by bigamy or politics. Once Henry decided to turn on Anne, his actions were quick and extreme. On May 2, 1536, Anne was arrested and charged with adultery, witchcraft, and incest. Several men, including Anne's brother George, were arrested and tortured under accusations of having intimate relationships with the Queen. George and some of the others were executed as a result of these unfounded charges. Historians widely agree that all of these charges were fabricated in the name of condemning the Queen. Anne was tried by her peers, but no member of the nobility stepped forward to help her. The main charge against Anne was adultery, which was seen as an act of treason for a queen. A handful of witnesses stepped forward to testify about sexual relationships Anne supposedly had with men of the court, including an incestuous relationship with her own brother. Whether or not these accounts were true, or whether or not anyone believed them, was irrelevant. Henry wanted Anne convicted and executed, so that's what happened. After Anne was found guilty of these charges, it was proclaimed that she would be put to death. Anne was left in agonizing uncertainty of whether she would be beheaded or burned at the stake. Her friend and supporter, Archbishop Cranmer, was eventually able to ease her mind by informing her that she would be beheaded, a much quicker and less painful death. As a concession for her former position as queen, she would be beheaded by a skilled swordsman rather than by a clumsy axe. On May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn became the first English queen to be publicly executed. She faced her fate with bravery and dignity. In her final words to the crowd, she asked God to bless the king and to have mercy on her. Anne was then blindfolded and knelt down before the block before the swordmen beheaded her. No coffin was provided, so Anne was unceremoniously buried in an old arrow box. Elizabeth was just 3.5 years old when her mother was executed. Henry VIII married his third wife, a woman named Jane Seymour, just 11 days after Anne Boleyn was beheaded. This wraps up part 1 on the 6 wives of Henry VIII. Part 2 will cover wives 3 through 6, and trust me, the romantic and political drama is just beginning. Thank you so much for listening. Be sure to check out the Salacious History page on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @SalaciousHist, that's SALACIOUSHIST. If you enjoyed today's episode, consider leaving a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps to get the word out about the show. This podcast is researched, written, recorded, edited, produced, and marketed all by me. So please, show me some much-needed love and support by partnering with me on Patreon.com. If you have corrections, funny stories, or ideas for future episodes, you can email me at salacioushistory@gmail.com. I'm Sarah Duncan. See you next time.